Hi, this is James, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of this viewer-requested video series where I'm sharing about my personal study and practice of cartomancy with playing cards. If this is your first time here, I'd like to say welcome, and if you're returning, I'd like to say welcome back. Well, this is it. In this video, we're going to be exploring the last of both the face cards, because we've been talking about the face cards at this point, but also the last of the cards in terms of meanings, because I've spent a great deal of time going over the meanings that I use when I work with playing cards in readings. And so we're moving from the queens, which we talked about in the last video, to this video we're talking about the kings. And so just as we've done in previous videos, in the next segment, I'll be talking more about the themes and associations that I have for the kings, as well as the pop culture references and phrases. And then we'll be moving on from that segment to talking about the kings one by one, up close and personal. The deck that has been assisting me throughout this video series is the Tally-Ho playing card, specifically number 13 in the series. And as I've said in previous installments, the reason why I like this deck so much is that it was designed by Jackson Robinson of King's Wild Project, and that was because he gave the court cards, which we've been talking about, a different kind of look. So that's the reason why I like this deck so much. So now that I've talked about the format and I've talked about the deck, let's now move to the next segment and take a look, or a closer look I should say, at the themes and associations that I use with the kings. And here we are with all the kings in the deck, and first and foremost, for me the kings can represent men. Following that, they can also represent male authority figures, and this is why. Because symbolically, the kings can represent the themes of power, control, and mastery. And when I talk about this idea of mastery, each one is the master of his domain. And his domain is represented by the suit emblem that they are each assigned to, which we'll talk about when we talk about them individually. And going with the numerical aspect of the card, kings are valued at 13 because they are the 13th card in each suit. And so when I thought about the number 13, I really didn't have a whole lot of personal associations or catchphrases other than the obvious, which is Friday the 13th. So because of the lack of personal associations with the number 13, I thought I would share this aspect, which you could also connect back to the queens and the jacks. So I'll talk more about that in a second. But for the kings, they also relate to the fours, the four cards in the deck, because 13 numerically reduces to 4. If you add the 1 and the 3, you get 4. So the kings correspond to the kings as a collective because they represent the number 13, but you could also associate them to the 4 cards. So I'm talking about the 4 of hearts, 4 of clubs, 4 of diamonds, and the 4 of spades, respectively. So I mentioned that to say this. All the catchphrases and pop culture references I made in the video about the 4 cards, you could also apply those to the kings. But now it was much easier to come up with some catchphrases or some pop culture references using the word king. So here are some for your consideration. First up, king of the castle, a la king, king size, kingpin, fisher king, fit for a king, every king needs a queen, king of beasts, king of the hill, and last but not least, a king's ransom. And so I mention all of those, as I always do, to get you thinking when it comes to the number 13, or again the number 4, or the idea of a king, what comes to mind for you? Because all those things that come to mind for you, you could possibly incorporate those phrases, themes, references into your own work with the cards. And so now that we've taken a look at the themes and associations, let's now start looking at the kings up close and personal, starting with the King of Hearts. First up, we have the King of Hearts, and for me, my first go-to meaning for this card is that it represents a married man. And besides being a husband, he can also be a father, so husband and father also can apply to this man. He represents the head of the family or the head of a household, and this is why. Because the King of Hearts is a paternal figure. The King of Hearts is someone who's very much loved or a beloved man. And because the suit of hearts can represent feelings and emotions, he can represent an emotional man. But here's the thing. Because the king aspect can represent control and mastery, he represents emotional control and emotional mastery. He has learned to control his emotions and master his feelings. And just like I talked in the previous video when it came to the Queen of Hearts about her being a woman of God, because for me the suit of hearts can represent God and aspects of God, then he is a man of God, which means that he can represent a religious or spiritual man. Usually for me, he would be somebody who is in the clergy. And personally speaking, when this card comes up, I tend to think of my own minister. Now, because the suit of hearts can represent healing, he is also a healer, much like his counterpart, the Queen of Hearts. But because of the king aspect, I look at this individual as being a master healer. Remember, kings can represent mastery. So some professions that I would put with that idea of being a master healer would be things like being a counselor or a therapist. Now remember, counselors and therapists help people deal with their emotions, help them learn to master or control their emotions, or help them process emotional experiences. So I tend to look at him as the counselor or the therapist, if he's not a clergy member. Now, as I said in the previous videos, when it came to the Jacks and the Queens, I don't normally ascribe physical traits or characteristics to the cards, but I will include them as I did with the previous individuals, the Queens and the Jacks. So this particular man could have brown or blonde hair. In terms of eye coloring, his eyes could be blue, gray, green, or hazel. And just like the Queen of Hearts, he would have a fair complexion. Now, just as I said with the physical traits or characteristics, I also don't ascribe astrological signs to the cards, but I will include those because I did that with the Queens and the Jacks in the previous videos. So astrologically speaking, I assign the sign of Scorpio to this card. And that will wrap up the King of Hearts. Next up, the King of Clubs. And here we are with our second king for this video, the King of Clubs. And for me, first and foremost, when he turns up, he represents a working man or a businessman. And because the king can represent a male authority figure, he can represent a boss, a manager, a supervisor. And because of the mastery aspect of the king, he can also represent a head of a business or a CEO. And sticking with the business aspect of the suit of clubs, for me he represents a business leader or a business authority. Now, because the suit of clubs can also represent being social and social activity, this king can represent a male friend. And bringing the working aspect back in, he could also represent a male peer, a male colleague, or a male co-worker. Now if we come back to the social aspect of the suit of clubs for a moment, this king can represent a male public figure. Again, going with the idea that the suit of clubs can represent the social aspect of life and the public. And he can also be someone who is quite sociable, so a sociable man. Now, some areas or industries of work that this king would be known for, first and foremost, would be business, which we've talked about, but also social work, or some kind of work in the community or community service, and along the same lines, public service. Now, he might be known for publicity work, so publicity, and with that, public relations and marketing, and also going with the more power and mastery aspect of the king, he could also be somebody who's in promotions. Now, in terms of physical characteristics, this king could have dark hair and dark eyes, or his eyes could be blue or hazel. And as far as complexion, he might have what some would consider olive skin. And the astrological sign that I would assign to this king would be Leo. And that will wrap up how I see the king of clubs. So now let's move on to the next king for this video, the king of diamonds. And here we are with our third king for this video, the king of diamonds. And first and foremost, for me, when he turns up, he represents a man of financial means, which means that I see him as being rich and or wealthy. If we bring the power and control and mastery aspect of the king into the picture, he can represent financial and or material control or mastery. If you remember, in the previous video when I talked about the Queen of Diamonds, his counterpart, I referred to her as being extravagant, right? That she was a pleasure seeker. He is quite different because of the control and mastery aspect of being a king. He tends to want to hold on to his wealth, to retain that financial gain that he has acquired. Now, because the suit of diamonds for me can represent energy, he is an energetic man. And because the suit of diamonds also represents power for me, he is a powerful man. And so that is a double reference, right? We have the suit of diamonds talking about power, and being a king, we talk about power. So he has, power in spades, and the pun is not intended. Right? So he would believe from a place of power that money is power, right? If we go with the idea that diamonds can represent money and finance, his belief is that money is power. And because the suit of diamonds can represent material resources, I see this king as being a resourceful man. Now, some industries that he might be associated with, one would be, of course, the financial sector. And he would be seen as either a financial authority or a power broker. He might also be in real estate, and if that's the case, he might be a real estate mogul, or the idea of a real estate tycoon. He could also be working in the environment or in environmental causes or concerns, again, because the suit of diamonds can represent the physical and the material. I tend to go with more of this aspect for the king of diamonds. I tend to look at him as the entrepreneur. So along those lines, he can represent a merchant on the lower end of the scale. And on the other end of the scale, he could also be a self-made millionaire. Remember, his belief is about money being power. And if he is in the merchant business, he may trade in high-end items and or goods. Now, in terms of physical characteristics, much like the Queen of Diamonds, his counterpart, he could have either blonde or red hair, More than likely, though, he will have gray hair. And he will have a very light complexion. In terms of eye coloring, his eyes could be of any color. And the astrological sign that I associate with this king is the sign of Taurus. And that will wrap up the King of Diamonds. And so now let's move on to the fourth and final king for this video, the King of Spades. And here we are with our fourth and final king, the King of Spades. First and foremost, when he turns up, for me, he represents a single man. And along those lines, he can represent a man who is separated, divorced, or is a widower. And again, because all those situations could create the possibility of becoming single. And because the suit of spades can represent difficulties and problems, he can sometimes be seen as being a difficult or a problematic man. And contrary to the King of Clubs, who I talked about as being a male friend, this particular king could be seen as a male rival. And again, that would be because the suit of spades can represent problems and difficulties. Now, because the suit of spades for me can also represent the mind and mental activity, this king is considered the intellectual. And he would be someone who would be considered somewhat highbrow because of the king aspect. Remember, kings can represent power, control, and mastery. So I see him as somebody who has a great deal of mental mastery, right? So just like the King of Hearts has learned to, control his feelings and master his emotions, this particular king has learned to, get control over his thinking or, has a strong or powerful mind. And because of that, he can be seen as being somewhat cool or detached, right? Because of being in his head so much. This card is known as the Man of Robes. And that could describe someone who might be a priest, a monk, or a judge. So remember, Man of Robes. But those aren't the only occupations that this king could be associated with. And here are some others. First, the King of Spades can be seen as a doctor, and specifically a psychologist or a psychiatrist because of the mind aspect of the suit of spades. He can also be seen as a surgeon, and that would be because of the cutting aspect of the suit of spades. Remember, for me, one of the things that the suit of spades can represent is elimination. And so a surgeon removes what is creating dis-ease in the body, right? And so that's a process of elimination. This king is also connected to the law and or law enforcement. Also science and medicine. And last but not least, the King of Spades can also be seen working in the government and politics. Now, in terms of physical characteristics or traits, this king has dark hair, dark eyes, and a dark complexion. And so since this whole series is about my personal work with the cards, I allow this king to represent me for two reasons. Number one, the physical characteristics, the dark hair, dark eyes, dark complexion, but also because this king can represent a single man, and I am a single individual. So this king represents me on those two fronts. And last but not least, let's talk about the astrological sign. So for me, this king represents the sign of Aquarius. And that will wrap up how I see the King of Spades and bring this video installment to a close. And there you have it. We talked about the kings and the themes and associations I have for them and the meanings I use for them when they turn up in a reading. And that will bring this video installment to a close. In the next installment, we'll take a look at the jokers and how I work with them in the deck. I'm Jameson Mitchell, and I'd like to thank you for sharing this space with me, and I look forward to being with you again in our next video together. So until then, I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.